This is one of the worst experiments ever conducted in the United States on people. It's the Tuskegee experiment. In 1932, 600 black men were recruited for a study in Alabama by being promised free medical care. 399 of these men were suffering from syphilis, a common STI, and the study promised medical care for the rest of their lives. But that's not what happened. Secretly, the study was designed to track the full progression of the infection, meaning that the subjects were not given real medicine. Instead, they were given aspirin and mineral substances. The progression of syphilis is terrible, and many men in the study went blind and insane. Meanwhile, researchers were watching this happen and did not intervene. Probably the worst part of this entire study was that in 1943, while the study was going on, penicillin became the most common cure of syphilis, but because it would have interrupted the study, none of the men were given it. The study was shut down in 1972, but at that point, many men had already lost their lives. President Bill Clinton formally apologized for the study in 1997, but for many, it was too little too late. The new Winnie the Pooh horror trailer just dropped. Let's take a look.
You know, you're the first person I ever shown this place to.
And why am I so special?
Because soon we'll be Christopher and Mary Robin.
Okay,
We
Christopher
should be
Robin.
close now.
We're not going to find them.
We will.
That's
Pooh, Piglet,
spooky.
Eeyore.
Okay.
We were friends for many years, and they're out there.
Christopher, we need to leave.
R.I.P. Eeyore.
Now.
I really need to find out what's happened there, okay?
No, you don't. You should probably leave. Abandoned by Christopher Robin. Oh my god. Oh my god.
This place is kind of
This
cool.
is
And
insane.
It has a pool.
no. No.
We need to go. There's.
No. No.
Laura, stay.
Oh my god.
There's someone else outside. What was that?
Stop. This is my childhood. This is my childhood. No.
We used to be friends. Why are you doing this, please?
We
I
used
would
to
have
be
never
friends.
left, I swear. I swear.
Is this what the world has come to? Winnie the Pooh, blood and honey. And then they're mixing the blood and honey. I'm gonna go see it. I'm gonna go see it. I'm gonna sit through it, every single minute of it, probably twice. This is insane, but this is the kind of stuff that I love. You've heard of Charles Manson, but I bet you haven't heard of Tony Costa. In 1968, young women were disappearing from Cape Cod, and Tony Costa seemed to be at the center of it. See, in his daily life, Tony Costa was a charming man. But Tony had another side of himself that he referred to as Corey. And Corey had a thirst for blood. He would lure his victims into this graveyard where he would promise them drugs, but instead would take their lives and dismember them. And since it was the 1960s and there were so many transient teens coming in and out of Cape Cod, it took police officers months to take any of these disappearances seriously. We know about his victims Patricia Walsh, Marian Wysocki, Susan Perry, and Sidney Monson, but there's potentially 4 others. And you can read all about Tony Costa in Helltown, Casey Sherman's new book. It's a great end of summer read, really putting you at the heart of coastal New England during the hippie movement, including all the love, drugs, and murder that took place. Let's talk about the shocking discovery that actually led to the release of Adnan Syed yesterday. As a recap, Adnan was convicted of killing his girlfriend, Hae-Min Lee, in 1999, but the evidence was not very convincing. And now it's come out that one of the detectives on the case, Bill Ritz, was actively hiding information on 2 other suspects in the case. One of these suspects actually told someone that they were very upset with Hae-Min Lee around the time of the murder, and that they were going to, quote, make her disappear. And detectives knew full well about this, but it never made it to trial. Now it's also come out that one, if not both of these suspects have relevant criminal history, one was accused of SA, and one is in jail for SA. And the evidence that the whole trial against Adnan hinged on was the fact that a person Adnan wasn't even really friends with came forward and said that Adnan did it, and cell phone records, which in 1999 were not really reliable. And let's not forget that the prosecutors really relied on the fact that Adnan was Muslim to accuse him and put him in jail, basically saying that the fact that he was dating in high school brought so much shame on his family that after she broke up with him, he had no choice but to murder her. 30 days to decide if they want to retry the case, but for now, Adnan is a free man. Some of you guys wanted more context on this case after I made this video, so don't worry, I read about this case so you don't have to. So this is Seth Welsh and Tatiana Fusari, and they're conservative Christian parents from Michigan who in 2018 let their 10-month-old daughter starve to death, and apparently didn't think there would be any consequences for that. In a pretty ridiculous 911 call, Tatiana called 911 at 10 a.m. the morning after she put her daughter down at 3:30 p.m., saying that she was unresponsive and she thought she was dead. But she also tells the 911 operator that she called her lawyer before calling the 911 operator, which is so sus. Also, who puts their baby down at 3:30 p.m. and doesn't check on them until 10 o'clock the next morning? Seth, the dad, also was notorious for believing in survival of the fittest. He didn't think that children should be vaccinated because he thought everyone that wasn't strong enough should die. And he apparently didn't think that his daughter would grow up to be strong enough to work on their farm and therefore wasn't feeding her. Tatiana knew something was wrong with her daughter, but she refused to call a doctor because she didn't trust the medical institution and for religious purposes. Anyways, both of them got life in prison, Seth without parole, and Tatiana has to do at least 25 years. Also, this is what their faces looked like when they found out that for starving a baby, you get life in prison. Have you ever wondered how accurate progression photos are? Progression photos are what detectives use on people that went missing years and years ago to kind of guess what they would look like today. So I'm going to show you some photos of missing children, what their progression photo looked like, and what they actually looked like when they were found. And if you're new to my page, I do all sorts of true crime and ghost stories, so make sure you're following along. So here's the first one. Here's two kids that went missing when they were children. And here's what detectives guessed they would look like as they got older. But here's what they actually looked like when they were found. As you can tell, like the hair color is wrong, general face shape is kind of right. I guess on the little boy it's more accurate, but these look like pretty much completely different people. So here's another one. Here's a baby that went missing. And this is what detectives thought he might look like when he got older, and granted, it's so hard to do this on babies. As you can tell, he doesn't really look anything like what his progression photo looked like when he was eventually found, but this little girl below has some similar features to what they thought she would look like as she got older. I'm so happy that this group of kids got found, but it's also proof that you need to find kids as quickly as possible because they just start looking so different so quickly. So there's this Reddit thread right now that says, I worked in a California state prison for 20 years and these are some of my paranormal experiences. And the stories in this thread are legitimately terrifying. But the scariest one is probably that one night a guard was down in solitary confinement counting all of the prisoners in each cell, just making sure that all 28 prisoners were accounted for. Each prisoner was supposed to have the appropriate paperwork filled out for them, but he noticed that there was one extra prisoner with no paperwork filled out. So the guy goes back to his station and calls his supervisor to ask about this unregistered prisoner. But the supervisor said no one should be in that cell. So the guard quickly runs back to the cell, but by that point, the mysterious prisoner is no longer there. And then he goes on to say that other guards had the same thing happen to them too. And if you've had any paranormal experiences, make sure you email me for a chance to be featured on my podcast. I keep seeing a lot of online discourse about the new Netflix Jeffrey Dahmer show and if it's actually exploitative, so let's take a little deeper look. Recently, it came out that one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims' siblings learned that the show was coming out when everyone else did. Her name's Rita Isbell and her brother was Errol Lindsay, and they use her likeness and name in the show pretty explicitly. Rita was known pretty publicly at the time for her outburst during the Jeffrey Dahmer trial, and you can see here, the show makes no bones about using her exact likeness and outburst to profit, and Rita is not partaking in any of the profit shares of this show. Personally, and this is just me, I also think the show makes a very specific choice by casting Evan Peters as Jeffrey Dahmer. Evan has a really specific online fan base of young girls who idolize the psychotic characters he plays. So it's not shocking to me that people are watching this show and tweeting insanities like this. The show is #1 on Netflix right now, meaning it's one of the most watched shows in the whole world. So I can't imagine being a victim's family member because it's everywhere. And though both Evan Peters and the show's creator Ryan Murphy have come out and said that they didn't want the show to be about Jeffrey Dahmer, they wanted it to be about the victims, there's not really a lot being done right now for the victims or their families. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments if you've seen it. If you thought Blonde did Marilyn wrong, wait till you hear this. Did you know that a man bought the crypt above Marilyn Monroe's so that he could be buried face down on top of her? I cover a lot of dark and true crime stories on this page, and this is one of the worst I've ever heard. His name is Richard Poncher, and he bought the space above Marilyn from her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio. Apparently, after he died, his wife told the funeral director that his dying wish was to be placed in a certain position with Marilyn, and they did it. Never mind that Hugh Hefner also bought the spot next to Marilyn Monroe, even though he had never met her. He started Playboy when he used her naked pictures without her consent and launched the magazine into stardom. There's a lot of people right now saying, let Marilyn rest, let her rest, leave her life alone. Well, the truth of the matter is she can't. Because for the rest of eternity, she's surrounded by predatory men that she did not ask to be placed anywhere near. This is the time I was almost abducted by a serial killer. In February of 2012, I went to go visit my grandfather's grave for his birthday. His death was a pretty hard thing for me to process, as he only died in March of 2011, so it was all still pretty new to me. I was kneeling in front of his grave, crying and thinking to myself, when all of a sudden I looked up and see a man running at me full speed from the woods in front of me. I was able to get myself to my truck pretty quickly before he got to me, but by the time I got in the truck, he was only about 50 feet away. I got in my car before he could get to me and locked the doors, much to his displeasure. He threw his hands up as if he had lost a football game. I started my truck and started driving out as fast as I could, but not before I passed him. I didn't break eye contact with him the entire time I was driving past, so I got a really good look at him. So cut to a few years later, I'm pretty bored at work, so I download this random app that has a bunch of paranormal, UFO, cryptid, and serial killer stories on it. And as I'm browsing through stories, I come across one that makes my heart absolutely drop. There was a photo of a man I recognized very well, Israel Keys, who was most known for murdering an underage girl in Alaska, dismembering her, and throwing the pieces of her body in a lake. He would bury kill kits in places long before he ever committed the crimes. He had been killing for a few years, to the point where no one really knew what his actual death toll was, and he would eventually go on to take his own life in prison. At the end of this book I read about him, they mentioned his favorite places to abduct people: public parks and cemeteries. I often wonder if he left any kill kits in that cemetery. You were fast, Israel, but I was faster. Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? I'm gonna show you a couple police sketches, and then we're gonna see what the people looked like when they were actually caught. And I cover all sorts of true crime and spooky stuff on this page, so make sure you follow along. Starting with this one. So this was a man who SA'd a minor, and this was the description that she gave to the police. And as you can see, this is really close. He has the big glasses that go up over his eyebrows, broad nose, really round face. Even the hairline is pretty similar. This is a woman who stole a baby from a maternity ward. And she was actually caught 10 hours after the sketch was released because she looks almost identical to it. So the witness who gave the description to the police officer for this one was actually intoxicated when he saw her. But that person basically got it identically correct. You can see her wispy bangs, super round face, the way that her hair comes down over the sides of her face. Even her eyebrow shape is perfect. These sketches were all done by a woman named Lois Gibson, who holds the Guinness World Record for most successful police sketch artist. She helped solve over 1,000 crimes in her 30-year career. This is the story of the girl who was kidnapped twice by the same man. Jan Broberg was just 12 years old the first time she was taken by her neighbor. His name was Robert Berchtold, and he was an expert manipulator. Leading up to the kidnapping, he had convinced her parents that she needed to sleep in the same bed as him for therapy. He had even convinced both her mother and her father to sleep with him. One day in 1974, Berchtold picked up Jan to take her horseback riding, but instead he took her to Mexico. While they were there, he convinced her that she was an alien and needed to conceive his child in order to save the human race. And because she was a child, she believed him. The abuse carried on until Jan was 16 and realized that he had been lying to her this entire time. But now she's telling her story because she's an executive producer on the Peacock show A Friend of the Family. Not only do I love this because the story will be told in a way that's approved by Jan, but it also means that she gets to profit from the show in a way that most true crime survivors don't get to. Let me know if you plan on watching. Nothing could have prepared me for the end of this story. So when I was little, I used to always complain about a scratching noise coming from the room next to me. My dad actually converted the guest bedroom next to my room into a home office, and I was never allowed in there. He was a really busy man. One night, I was laying in bed, unable to sleep, when I thought I heard a small sob come from his office. I could faintly make out the sound of a woman crying, but I knew I wasn't allowed to go in there. And honestly, at that point, I was kind of too afraid to anyways. The next day, I told my dad what I had heard, and he told me it was probably just a bad dream. But that didn't make any sense to me because I knew what I had heard. My dad spent the entire day in his office that day. I didn't see him come out once. The next night, I waited until my father was asleep, and I did what I knew I shouldn't do. I went into his office. And when I opened the door, there were no books. There was no desk. There wasn't even a single chair. Just scratched into the walls a million times. Help me.